Hi, everyone. So as Josh said, I've been at Uber for a long time. My 3-year anniversary is coming up in a few weeks. So Uber was about 20 people, as you said, when I joined, and had no PMs. And I've been lucky enough to be there for 3 years now, and just see an unprecedented rate of growth. And one of the things I've learned is that when you have this kind of growth, it really changes the way in which you do product development because you have to constantly be thinking about what's coming next, even when you don't know what's coming next. So while it's an incredibly exciting thing to have, it definitely changes the way in which you think about product management and how you do it. So I want to talk a little bit about what a principle that we use, which is called designing for flexibility. Go into a couple of case studies about two things that have happened to Uber. One was Paris, which was our first international launch in December 2011, and then talk about car types, which we launched in July of 2012, because there was a time actually when all you could ever do with Uber was take a black car around San Francisco. And so it was a really big challenge and interesting problem that we have to solve, and I think one that really encapsulated this concept of designing for flexibility. And then I'll take a little bit of time at the end just to talk about what's next and what we're thinking about for the future. So what is designing for flexibility? I had a tough time trying to think about how to encapsulate this principle in like one sentence, and this is sort of what I came up with, which is building products that work today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And that's a very deliberate placement of today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Today is, you've got to build things that work for the thing you're trying to do right at this moment in time. Otherwise, the product just isn't going to work. But you can't forget all of the things that you've already built, and you have to focus on the backwards compatibility of it, which is what the yesterday is. And then lastly, after you've built something that works today, after you've built something that works for what you've already done so far, you also still have to think about what you don't know, which is the tomorrow. And that's really what designing for flexibility is all about, is thinking about all of those things at the same time, but in a very specific order and making sure that you account for them. So the thing about designing for flexibility is that it sounds great in theory, but sometimes like reality gets in the way, right? And so this was the case for us in 2011, sort of towards the end of the year. So Travis and I were having a conversation like early November, and he mentioned he was going to be speaking at LeWeb, and then said something along the lines of, God, wouldn't it be awesome if we launched Paris too? It was like, yeah, that's awesome. Let's launch Paris in 30 days. And this is kind of where it went to. So we started out in sort of early November, and I started putting together a requirements document of like, okay, well, so how are we going to do this? And of course, this requirements document started getting longer and longer and longer and longer because nothing we did worked anywhere except San Francisco and New York. So you can imagine our apps, our websites, our emails, our SMSs. We had to figure out how to send SMS in Paris because we only had like a New York and San Francisco phone number. We had to do translations. We had to think about how to charge in euros. And we knew we weren't going to be able to get a merchant account in 30 days. So it was like, all right, well, I guess we'll just charge in dollars and think about how to convert that to euros later on. Maybe we'll give people a discount because there's going to be foreign transaction fees. We had to think about promotions, like how do we give people euros off when we only charge in dollars? Wait, we don't have euro credit. So it got larger and larger and larger. And that was the point at which the case shipments of 5-hour energy started to arrive. Thank you, Amazon Prime. And so we made it. We made it all the way. December 2011 happened. Travis launched Paris at LeWeb on December 8th at his keynote speech. And it was awesome. We really had a great time. But we absolutely did not design for flexibility. And I think this is another key point, right? Growth requires flexibility. And flexibility doesn't just necessarily mean designing for flexibility. It means knowing when to throw away designing for flexibility. Because there's no way that we could have launched Paris in 30 days while building a robust, maintainable system to get to where we wanted to go. But we did it. And so that's the important thing, is we got to where the place that we wanted to be at, even though we didn't necessarily follow our principles along the way. Of course, what that meant is this is what the next 6 months was like. So we had to rewrite everything, we had to refactor it, we had to rebuild it, we had to redesign it, because that was the only way we were ever going to be able to launch more international cities. I think we were all pretty sick of 5-hour energy at this point. And just in case you're wondering, the grape, definitely the best one. So growth is a great problem to have. I'm not complaining about growth. It's like I'd much rather have that than the opposite problem. But it is important to think about it as a very real, as a problem. It is something that you actually have to think about and manage as you're going through the process of creating product development. Because growth is one of those things where you have to build products and do the work that you need to do to manage the momentum that's coming your way. But at the same time, you also need to be able to spur innovation. So growth in the products that you build should not only handle the growth, but should actually lead to increased growth. And so it feels like you're just running to catch up with everything, only to push it even further and faster ahead so that you can run even faster to keep on going. And that's kind of the exciting thing, though, about building products in a really, really high growth environment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about car types, which we started in probably like March 2012 or so. So about 3 months after Paris, we'd recovered a little bit. And this was something we knew we'd wanted to do for a long, long time, where it was just black cars everywhere. And we wanted to be able to even support basic things like, it was even before the time that we had thought about UberX. It was like, well, sometimes people just want SUVs because they have more than 4 friends and they have to be able to go out on a Saturday night. And that's really actually what prompted car types. And so we were like, okay, well, how are we actually going to build car types and build it in the right way? And we spent a lot of time thinking about it. So here's what car types used to look like in 2012. So this first image that you see here is March 2012, South by Southwest. That was our original on-demand event. It was on-demand barbecue at South by Southwest. And if you didn't update your apps for like months in San Francisco, you'd see little cows wandering around the map because that was the original car type that we used to have. And then the one over on the far side is Cuatro de Mayo, which is our first ever on-demand event. It was on-demand mariachi, and probably still one of my favorites. And then that what you see in the middle right there is actually the official launch of car types, which we did in July 2012 to coincide with Independence Day. So it was the freedom of choice, the liberation, and independence for car types at Uber. And of course, we went on to do a lot of really fun, interesting, different types of cars. Ice cream, which was really popular all around the world, even San Francisco where it's cold. But, people love ice cream. Uber Kittens. So this was, I think this was the day that I felt like we owned the internet. It was amazing. I calculated later that we would need about 25 football field lengths of kittens in order to be able to satisfy the demand. Don't know where we're going to get those from, but I think puppies are coming up soon. Uber Valentine's, another fun one. And then this one was one of my personal favorites, which is Ubercade, which was President's Day in Washington, D.C. So if you happen to request a black car on President's Day in D.C., you might be one of those lucky people that was randomly surprised by getting your full-on motorcade. And so people got black cars and SUVs with American flags on them, and everybody thought they were the president. And there's fantastic videos on our blog. I highly recommend going to check those out. I think we should do it every year. And then this one, which was our collaboration with GE, we had DeLoreans on the street of San Francisco, so it was Uber Time Machine for a day. And so, this wasn't an easy thing to do. There were tons and tons of really big problems that we had to face in order to actually be able to make this happen. So the first one is surge pricing. Surge pricing is hard enough when you have one car type in one city. So now you start to think about, okay, well, there's UberX, and then there's Uber Black, and then there's Uber SUV. How do we do surge pricing across all of these things? Because the other thing to keep in mind is that when we had Uber Black, it didn't just include black cars, it also included SUVs. And so sometimes if you got an SUV, it would be surge priced, but other times it wouldn't be surge priced. Wait, how does that work? How do we make those things fit together? What happens when your Uber X's are surging, and they're surging at 2.25, and then your black cars aren't surging at all? And so all of a sudden, people are suddenly paying a lot more than they would, even if they requested a more expensive car. It's not a great rider experience. So trying to think about how all of these different car types and the way that they were going to change and work over time, including another really interesting example with surge pricing is that it doesn't work very well when you don't have a lot of cars. And so, because you can imagine it's like, okay, so we've got 2 cars now for a particular like UberX, and they're at 100% if both people use them. So that means what, surge pricing is going to go through the roof? Like, can't really do those kinds of things. And this was definitely at a time where we didn't have that many cars and we didn't have that many cities. So we had to be really conscious of how we did these things, especially as our cities got larger, or as our cities were quite small, and then as they got larger over time. So that was a really big problem that we had to think about. And also, because surge pricing is algorithmic, like, it doesn't always know about the reality of the situation. And so not only that, we had to build on top of surge pricing, once we started doing it with all these different car types, ways to be able to allow cities to manually manage that if that's what they needed to, because sometimes you just need human intervention. And that's what it means to, again, design for flexibility. It's like, yeah, we'd love to do everything algorithmically all the time, but there are times where it just doesn't work. And you need to have a way to be able to push back against that and do the kinds of things that you need to do there. Vehicle management. So this one's really interesting because I think on the outside sometimes it looks like car types. Oh yeah, so you just like add another like category on the site and then you drop them in. It's not quite that way. So every single car that comes on the system now has to be categorized. So, now we have hundreds of thousands of cars, right? Let's say, are you really going to sit down and categorize every single car into the appropriate car type? That's probably not going to work. So we thought, okay, well, let's do it this way instead. What we'll do is we'll say, like, every single sort of general type has different models. So, like, generally a Lincoln Town Car, we know that's a black car. It's not an UberX, and it's definitely not an SUV. And we know what an SUV is, so we can classify those types of cars. So that way, when we add a car onto our system, we just have to say what type of car it is, and it will automatically fall into the right category. Well, it doesn't always work that way, because what if you've got, kind of a serviceable 2006 Lincoln Town Car? Probably don't want that on the black car system, because people expect a higher level of service. So now it has to be UberX. So you have to build tools and products that then allow you to say, when a car comes onto the system, okay, this is its default, this is generally how it goes, but you have the full flexibility to change it and move it into a different category if you want to, so that it can be appropriately dispatched in that way. So that was one thing that had to happen. Then, so now we've got 2 layers, right? So we've got like 2 levels already. It's just like, here's what it is generally, and then here's like the exception. So now you have to manage it that way. Well, okay, so let's add another layer, right? In all cities, not everybody has enough SUVs to really just be able to manage that level of supply, because not everyone wants SUVs all the time. They tend to be more of an exceptional case, which means that if you have an SUV then, and you're waiting for only people who are going to request SUVs, you're probably not going to get very many rides throughout the night. So you want to be counted and included in the black car classification, so that when somebody tries to request a black car, they may or may not get an SUV. And that way, as a driver, you're going to get rides as well. So on the outside, to a rider, in the app, you're just going to see black car. But on our side, we have to remember that, like, black car and SUV actually fit together under one section. And so, okay, that's another level of, like, complication that we have to introduce. And so it continues to kind of get this way. And actually, the way that car types works internally at Uber is that it's a 5-layer system, and it's different in every single city and sometimes in different countries as well, right? Because everything starts to change. Like, we have this fare calculation system that defines, like, okay, you go this far, this is how much you get charged. You take this much time, this is how much you get charged. Well, what happens when you introduce taxis? It doesn't work the same way anymore. It's like now somebody has to think about, like, what the taxi fare is and, like, how to introduce it. Well, what happens when you start to get ice cream trucks? They don't get charged the same way anymore either. So how does that work? And so the more car types you try to introduce, the more areas and properties that those different car types have, and the more you have to be able to account for them. And so you have to build products that then allow you to go in and actually deal with those kinds of things so that you can, move forward with it. Last one is localization. So, there's definitely more challenges than these. I just wanted to highlight some of the biggest ones that we faced, right? Localization. I don't know if you remember what our website looked like back in the day, but I do. It was looked like it was like circa 1990s, and there was like a big black town car on the front and the San Francisco skyline in the back. So, and it still looked like that, by the way, when we launched Paris. We just photoshopped out the skyline. And so in Paris, for example, black cars are not called black cars. They're called berlines. And so we had to think about, like, well, all right, so we need to have some way to be able to still reference this as a black car, because if we want to compare analytics, like see how black cars are doing in different markets, we have to have some way to be able to manage that, but at the same time have some kind of display system so that people understand when they're trying to request these particular types of cars in the area that they're in, well, that's what it actually means. That's how it works. Another example, in London, we wanted to introduce SUVs, and they don't call SUVs in London. They call them people carriers. And so we're like, how do we fit people carrier on a mobile screen with that much space? And we really tried, but didn't work. So we went back to the London team and we thought, okay, well, people carrier is just not going to work. What else do people call them? And they came up with a bunch of different names, like MPVs and vans and all these other kinds of things. We're like, I don't know, I'm just not feeling it. So they went back, and later that night, they emailed us. They're like, we've got it. We know exactly what it's going to be called. We're going to call it Big. And so I was like, okay, well, just checking here, right? Like, that if you open up the app in London then, you're going to see a map. And at the top, you're going to have 2 buttons that say big and black. That's probably not going to work. So, this was like and this happened multiple times. It's probably the funniest example. So, it's a real challenge to think about. You're building these systems. You're trying to make them be flexible. You're trying to make them work everywhere. But every single place is different. How do you account for it? How do you deal with those kinds of things? And so this is really where we had a couple of lessons learned along the way from, at this point, a fair number of products that we had done, a fair number of international expansions. So here's a great one. We'll build the back end first and worry about the front end administration later. So every time somebody wanted to do something, we had to take an engineer off whatever he was doing, have him go in, manually update the database, and then do a code deploy. So you can imagine this didn't work very well for a long, long time. And I think like this is probably one of the things that I think is one of the most like powerful things that we've done at Uber, which is really to think about how technology and operations intersect and build products for operations to be able to like spur their creativity. And when we built car types, like the thought that we had in mind is like, we want cities to be able to turn on a car type, to turn on, if they decide tomorrow that they want to do kittens, they can do it. And it doesn't require any engineering time or any engineering effort. And that's the point that we got to, where we built the products and the systems in such a way that a city team would simply go in and say like, okay, I want to create this. This is the way it should be charged. This is what it should look like. Done. Zero engineering involvement, zero product involvement, zero design involvement. Except, of course, unless you needed some kind of like special icon, like a kitten or something like that on the map. So then we did that. So I think there's a huge, huge part of like what enabled us to like move quickly is that we focused on making things as self-service as possible. It wasn't about putting engineering in the way. It was about getting engineering and product out of the way. Here's another one. We're going to require it to be the same for every city. Worked great when we had 5 cities. Not so much when we had even 20 cities, right? And it was like, oh, well, you can't just have, you're only allowed to have black and SUV. You can't have taxi. And it was like, well, that's not going to work. So really thinking about ways in which you can build products that allow for customization. Like you have to allow cities to be able to develop and build the kinds of services that they need that are unique to their local market. Here's another great one. We'll just add updates to new cities manually. Again, worked fine when we were doing cities at the rate of like 1 a month. Not so great when we're doing cities at the rate of like 5, 6, 7 a week, you know? And it was really, again, build products that allow people to do things by themselves, that allow them to still maintain the coherency and the consistency of Uber as a whole, but at the same time, give them the flexibility they need to adapt to their local market. And so kind of brings us to where we are tomorrow, right? So there's two screens up here. Not quite sure if you can see this, but the first one there is Chicago. And it has a lot of car types on it. In fact, so many that they're all crossing over each other. And so we really have to start to think now about, well, what are we going to do when we run out of space? Like, how is that going to work? We have to account for a future in which there's more choice than ever, right? Like, we want to be able to do that kind of thing. Choice is ultimately like a really core principle of what we do. And then choice in another aspect is like what you see on the screen next to it, which is New York. And in New York, we've introduced our Uber Rush program. So this is like a bike courier messenger service. So it's no longer just transport. Well, it's not quite the same anymore. You have to make that choice about like, do I want transport or do I want something else? If I want something else, what's the other thing? How does that all fit together? And at the same time, we still want the experience to feel Uber, right? Like you don't want to open up, depending on the different types of cars that you have, you don't want to feel like it's not Uber. It should always be like, oh yeah, this is Uber. And the fact that it's a different type of car, or a different type of service, or a different type of experience is very secondary to that. It doesn't matter because you know that you can come to expect a certain level of quality and consistency and just high level awesomeness, really, overall from Uber. So sort of to recap, what I think the core principles of designing for flexibility are: work today. You have to know what you're trying to accomplish right now, and you have to be able to like build products that are going to get you there. Work yesterday. You can't throw away everything that you've done in the past. You really still have to be able to account for it overall. And then work tomorrow. Think about what you don't know and where things are going to go, because that is what is going to create great products. That's what's going to allow you to use growth to spur innovation. That's what's going to allow you to not have to rewrite, rebuild, redesign, refactor. And lastly, enable operational creativity. And this one might be a little bit unique to Uber in the sense that we have these two engines that are running at the same time. We have technology, we have operations, and together, that's what makes Uber what it is. It's what allows it to be really unique and special, is we've got two great teams that are moving forward on their way, like operations in the way of like moving the business forward, and technology in terms of moving the business forward, and they just operate in different perspectives. So that is designing for flexibility at Uber. Thank you.
So I was wondering, how did you convince Travis and the other guys that we need to build in this flexibility for tomorrow and not focus on delivering something right now, and then also balance we're growing really fast, we need to refactor, and we can't be shipping new features all the time?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, trying to convince Travis that we needed to build for tomorrow really wasn't that hard. We always had sort of our eye on the like, okay, we're going to go international and we're going to go there. So it wasn't that. The way I think in which we did it is that we didn't stop delivering new features. We actually just sort of we put most of the engineering team towards focusing on like, here's the future, here's where we're going, and then we always had some of the engineering team focusing on like, okay, what are like things that we need to do because the business doesn't stop, growth doesn't stop, right? You have to, again, plan for the future, but at the same time, remember, you've got today to move on, because if your business suddenly stops, there is no future. So, it was just kind of maintaining that division. It wasn't an equal division. We had to put a lot more people towards building core architectural systems, but we didn't stop innovating on the other fronts as well. One last question, I guess we'll go over here.
Could you talk about how you are balancing the quality of the drivers and the prices and the time to pick up and all of those things in terms of user perception of the product and how users can perceive you versus competitors? And
Sure. So I think that, so Amazon, for example, has its like, core principles of like convenience, selection at the lowest possible price. I actually think it's pretty similar with Uber as well, right? We want to give you as much choice and as many options as possible at the lowest possible price. And that's not going to be, we can't do that unless the drivers are happy too, right? But drivers are happy when they're earning well and they're making more. And so the more we can do to kind of like, that's what I think we do well at Uber, is managing this balance of supply and demand. There are different things that they're looking at, but ultimately the incentives are aligned. Everybody wants to make as much money as possible, but at the lowest possible price. And those things actually work together really well in the way that we do it. I mean, there are things that are hard, right? Like surge pricing, not everyone's favorite thing, but it keeps the system moving, it keeps the things going. And at the end of the day, you can always get a car when you need it. And that's what Uber is about.
Let's give Mina a big round of applause.